Greetings folks, welcome. I'm sorry that I left you hanging after the last video about small businesses and economic development. That's not cool. It reminds me of TV shows in my youth where they used to have a two-part series where you had to wait an entire week to find out what happened. That was before binge watching was a thing. Anyways, to bring you back up to speed with where we left off, the previous video looked at the effect of small businesses, these were businesses with fewer than 10 workers, and large companies, these were establishments with 250 or more employees, on the economic development of regions. And we had three key takeaways from the earlier video. First, we learned that research on the effects of business size on economic development is mixed, and the results really depend on the approach you take, whether you're studying job creation or overall employment dynamics, and the indicator you focus on, whether it's employment or wages. Second, we learned that most U.S. businesses are quite small. For example, 85% have fewer than 20 people, and 73% have fewer than 10 workers, but most people, including myself, work for large companies. Finally, we found that having a high share of small businesses appears to be good for regional economic development. Here's a figure that we looked at in the first video, which summarizes what I mean by small businesses being good for economic development. The figure shows the effects of small businesses, here we're defining them as having fewer than 10 workers, on the employment, income, persistence, and overall economic development indices. And I show the results for states and metropolitan areas. The height of the bars represents the size of the impact in terms of standard deviations when we increase a region's share of small businesses by 1 standard deviation. So the second to last bar on the right tells us that a 1 standard deviation increase in a state's percentage of small businesses corresponds with about a 0.35 standard deviation increase in the overall economic development index of states. The bars are shaded in red to indicate results that are statistically significant. Overall, the results show that small businesses are good for the various aspects of regional economic development, other than the stability of jobs over time. Here's a similar figure, except the focus is on large businesses with 250 or more employees. And the results are quite different than what we found in the analysis of small businesses. That is, whereas the bars in the last figure pointed up, these ones are pointing down. This means that for all 4 of the indices we use to measure the economic development of regions, a region's share of large businesses has a negative effect, and it's statistically significant in 7 of the 8 cases we show here. In the last video, I hinted that the effects of large businesses on economic development could be picking up, at least in part, the influence of having a lot of manufacturing plants in a region. And this sort of makes sense because manufacturing plants tend to be large businesses. There are certainly economies of scale in a lot of manufacturing processes, so manufacturing plants tend to be quite large. Also, in the last video, we saw that the top places for large businesses are regions that are well known for manufacturing. Metropolitan areas such as Oshkosh, Wisconsin, Dalton, Georgia, and Sheboygan, Wisconsin were among the leaders for the percentage of businesses with 250 or more employees. If I ask people in economic development to tell me what Oshkosh, Dalton, and Sheboygan have in common, the first thing that they would say is that these places are manufacturing regions. In fact, I doubt if many economic development practitioners would say, well, hey, these places have high shares of large businesses. So it's certainly plausible that a result showing a negative effect of large businesses on economic development could be reflecting the effects of manufacturing on the growth of good jobs. This is because we learned in a different video that having a specialization in manufacturing has no effect or even a negative impact on regional economic development. So to account for the potential influence of industry on our results related to business size, I calculated new measures of business size that make adjustments for the influence of industry. In a nutshell, I made these adjustments by comparing a region's share of small and large businesses, so I essentially performed this type of analysis twice, to the share predicted by its industrial structure. So if a place has a lot of manufacturing firms, the industrial structure of the region would predict a large percentage of big companies and a lower share of small businesses. Let's use Wisconsin as an example. Wisconsin had the highest share of manufacturing employment back in 1990, and the state ranked 42nd in terms of the percentage of small businesses. The fact that Wisconsin is near the bottom for small businesses makes sense because of the importance of manufacturing to the state. But if you use data on the industries present in Wisconsin to predict the state's share of small businesses and then compare the actual percentage of small businesses to what's predicted, Wisconsin actually had a relatively larger small business share than what you would expect. According to this measure of comparing the actual small business share to what you would predict based on industries, Wisconsin's adjusted small business share was 32nd nationally, which puts the state closer to the middle. Now let's take another look at the relationship between economic development and the size of businesses in a region. But this time we'll use numbers that are adjusted for the types of industries present in a region. Here's a figure that summarizes the effects of small businesses after adjusting for industry on economic development. You'll see that after adjusting for industry, most of the statistically significant effects that we found earlier went away. Here's the original figure that does not adjust for industry, and here are the results when we do account for the influence of industry on a region's share of small businesses. So we can say that after accounting for the types of industries in a region, the effects of small businesses on economic development are quite modest. We can do the same thing for the percentage of large businesses in the region. As a reminder, here's a figure when we do not account for the influence of industry. Now, after accounting for the industrial structure of a region, it looks like, bam! Wow, the figure is basically unchanged. So after accounting for the industry structure of regions, most of the positive effects of small businesses on economic development disappear. But the negative impacts associated with large businesses barely budge. Considering the impacts of large businesses on economic development, even after accounting for industry structure, does this mean that regions should just simply attempt to increase their share of small businesses and really sort of ignore larger businesses? To put this idea into context, the data show that about 73% of U.S. businesses have fewer than 10 workers. But given what we've learned about large businesses, should regions attempt to grow the share of small businesses even higher? To answer this question, we'll look at the relationship between the economic development of regions and the change between 1990 and 2014 in the share of small businesses, and then as a separate analysis, large companies. So this will get at the question of whether a growing share of small or large businesses help the economic development of regions. This figure summarizes the effects of a growing share of small businesses on the employment, income, persistence, and overall economic development indices. Like before, I show the results for states and metropolitan areas. But unlike what we saw when we focused on a region's share of small businesses back in 1990, now when we look at the change in the share of small businesses between 1990 and 2014, the results show either negative or no impact on our measures of economic development. That is, regions that saw an increase in the share of businesses with fewer than 10 employees, so let's say a place's small business share went from 72% to 75%, that's what I mean by growth in the share of small businesses, these places did not experience higher levels of economic development. What about regions that increased the share of businesses with 250 or more workers? Recall that less than 1% of U.S. businesses fall within this size category. So an example of growing the share of large businesses could be an increase from, say, 0.5%, that's 1 in 200, to 1%, that's 1 in 100. And the results here are pretty impressive. For all 4 of the economic development indices, and for states and metropolitan areas, an increasing share of large businesses from 1990 to 2014 corresponds with higher levels of economic development. So let's summarize what we learned about changes in the shares of small and large businesses. First, an increasing share of large businesses is good for economic development. On the other hand, an increasing share of businesses with fewer than 10 employees, that's how we define small businesses, is not associated with the growth of good jobs. And these results are almost the opposite of what we found when we focused on the shares of small and large businesses way back in 1990. This tells us that a key to regional economic development is to help small businesses grow into larger businesses. It's not to increase the percentage of small businesses in a region. The reason behind this is pretty straightforward, with a nice connection to our definition of economic development. First off, the transition from small to large businesses generates employment growth. Second, larger companies pay higher wages and offer more stable employment. So helping businesses grow hits on all three aspects of how we define economic development, which is the growth of good jobs in a region to improve the well-being of people in the places where they reside. And of course, we define good jobs in terms of their pay and stability over time. Hopefully, after watching this second video about business size and economic development, you have a better understanding of the nuances of how small and large businesses affect the growth of good jobs in a region. In this video, we learned that after accounting for the influence of industries present in a region, most of the impacts of small businesses on economic development go away. This is a different impression of small businesses than we had at the end of the first video about business size. But perhaps more important, we learned in this video that small businesses can help regional economic development because they sometimes grow into larger companies. And small establishments growing into larger businesses ticks off all three aspects of economic development in terms of employment growth, wages, and stability. So the challenge for economic development is to identify small businesses that are poised for growth and help them expand.